That was Jenny Lewis singing Black Sand. And just before the break, we were talking about coloration and methods of blending in and making yourself less obvious. And one additional thing that I did not mention is the idea of counter shading and counter illumination. And this is something that was actually introduced by an artist named Abbott Thayer, who was both an artist and a naturalist and actually also a teacher. And basically he was really interested in animal coloration in general. And he would just spend hours and hours out in the field looking at animals and just thinking about the different coloration patterns that they had and trying to figure out how best to represent them. And basically he was the first person to recognize that there was a certain pattern, well, literally and figuratively, that emerged as he was thinking about all these different animals that he encountered. And what he noticed was that there were a lot of animals that had light bellies and dark tops. And he was looking actually at terrestrial animals when he did this, when he made this recognition. And he proposed that there had to be a reason that he was seeing this again and again in different types of animals. And he suggested that what was happening was that you had these animals that wanted to blend in from both below and above. So if you think about maybe a squirrel that spends a lot of its time on the ground and also sitting in a tree. So the squirrel is going to be vulnerable to predation by something like an eagle up in the sky. And if an eagle looks down, what it's going to see is, it's going to see a dark ground. And so the squirrel wants to have a dark top so that it fits in with that dark ground and doesn't stand out. But it's also going to be vulnerable to things that are preying on it from below. So if it's up in a tree, maybe you're sitting up on a bush, and there's maybe, I don't know, a cat or any other kind of thing that would be looking up at it, then it would want to look more like the sky, which is the prominent feature up above, and which is most of the time quite light in comparison to the other things that are going to be up, tree canopies and stuff. And so basically that's why the animal would want to have a light stomach. And so Thayer recognized that this kind of coloration, this counter shading, was something that enabled animals to have plumage that could protect them from two different directions at once. And he proposed this back in the, I believe, the early 1900s. And actually, yeah, I think his book came out in the first couple decades of the 1900s. And it very quickly became accepted, actually, and is still accepted to this day, that is why we have these counter shading patterns. And it wasn't until later, when we had a lot of people being able to film things in the ocean, that we realized that the same thing is happening in marine environments, but the color pattern is different. So in marine environments, you tend to have a slightly different lighting scheme, and what you see from above and below is it's similar in some ways, but different in others, depending on what layer of the habitat you're in. So you can also have animals with dark tops and light bellies, but you can also have the reverse, depending on how deep under the water they are and how much light the environment gets. Now, counter-illumination is kind of a variation on this, and basically this is the idea that instead of having coloration in order to blend in, different color on different parts, you actually produce your own light in order to better match a background and kind of get rid of shadow. And this is going to be especially good for animals that are seen from below, up against a brighter sky. And this is something that we know very well, and in fact, we may only know this from marine environments. And a great example of this is squid, such as the sparkling Enope squid and the midwater squid. And these guys will change the way that they are perceived by animals in the environment by changing how light they are and then completely blending in. And you can actually find videos of this, and it's really incredible, actually. If you ever see it, you can just watch the footage and it doesn't look like there's anything there at all, and then all of a sudden the camera zooms in and you can see an eyeball or something, and it's amazing how well they completely blend in. Now, one last type of camouflage that I want to mention is dazzling. So one form of camouflage that works, this is one form of camouflage that actually works while animals are in motion instead of when they're still. So most of the time you think of camouflage as being something that you want to use to keep yourself hidden, so you kind of huddle down and stay still until something passes. But dazzling works by making it very hard for animals to see you as an individual relative to other things that are around you, and also to make it difficult for potential predators to judge your speed or your size or your range or your direction, and basically just to have a hard time concentrating on some aspect of you that would help it to catch you and get you out of the crowd. And this is achieved with rapid moving animals and with bold patterns. And so the classic example of this is the zebra stripe, where you've got this trade-off between dazzle and crypsis. So when zebras are standing still, obviously they're very obvious in the habitat. They really stand out. But as soon as they all start moving, even if it's a zebra alone, but especially if it's a zebra in a big pack, it's quite difficult for a predator to really cue in on that animal and try to take it out, because it just completely blends in with all of the other animals around it and makes it difficult for a lion, for example, to pick out the one that it wants to take down. Now, speaking of things that are obvious, the next kind of general category of coloration and patterning are things that animals use to make themselves obvious on purpose. And one of these is actually something I've spoken about a little bit before, and that's having warning coloration. And this word is my kryptonite, but it's called aposematism or aposematic coloration. And basically, as I said, this is the opposite of camouflage, because you want to deliberately show animals, here I am, but you don't want to mess with me because I taste bad, or I'm venomous, I'm poisonous, I'm very dangerous, so for whatever reason you want to stay away. And this is a primary defense mechanism that's always based on a secondary defense mechanism, or it's one that is based on pretending that you have a secondary defense mechanism, whether as I said, that's poison or venom or just being dangerous or whatever. And so animals can use lots of different things like sounds, odors, or whatever, but I happen to be mentioning coloration as this thing that they use to indicate that they're kind of dangerous and should be left alone. And lots of animals that do this, as I said, are unpalatable, so ladybugs are a really good example of that. They can be poisonous, so toxin or venom is found in these insects, or spiders or poisonous frogs, or whatever the case may be. And these sorts of signals are actually beneficial not just to the signaler, but also to the receiver, because if you are a receiver, then it's really handy for you to see a bright red or yellow or white coloration, or this really, big contrast between yellow and black or white and black. These are all very common signals of something that's dangerous, and it's very handy for you to be able to see that and say, hey, maybe I should stay away from that. Because if you learn that cue, or if you're born with that cue innately embedded in your mind, then that means that you can avoid getting hurt or avoid getting killed, and that's really useful. Obviously, it's quite useful to the thing that then doesn't get hurt or doesn't get eaten. And animals, as I said, that don't have these unpleasant characteristics of their own, they don't have that secondary defense mechanism, they can rely on the defense mechanisms of other animals by mimicking them. And this is basically something that allows them to hide in plain sight by resembling another animal that's poisonous or distasteful or avoided for some reason. And the animal will be seen, but it will be avoided. So there are a few different types of mimicry. One of them is Batesian mimicry, so this is when you look like something that is distasteful, even when you're not distasteful yourself, and that makes sure that you are avoided because animals have learned to avoid those other organisms. And one example of this is hoverflies that look like bees, so they have the same kind of black and yellow coloration. Malarian mimicry is quite different because lots of unpleasant things all look unpleasant in the same way. And this basically strengthens the avoidance behaviors of other organisms. So, again, keeping with the theme of bees, you've got lots of bees and wasps that all indicate that they are stinging things with black and yellow coloration. Another example is also the monarch and the viceroy butterfly. Both of these guys are actually quite unpleasant, and so by looking alike, they kind of reinforce this unpleasantness. There's something else that I actually hadn't heard about until I was doing a little bit of research for this show, and that's called Mertensian or Emslian mimicry. And basically this is something where you've got something that is deadly itself, and rather than being the form that other things mimic, it actually itself mimics something that's less harmful. And this is quite an unusual thing, and people couldn't think, well, why would this possibly be the case? And the theory about this was developed by looking at milk snakes in North America. And there were all these milk snakes that were looking like false and also deadly coral snakes, but also deadly coral snakes that looked like false coral snakes. And so why is it that if you are this poisonous coral snake, you know, it's quite obvious why a safe milk snake would look like you, but why would you want to look like something else? Well, basically it takes advantage, this coloration pattern, of animal learning, because basically it gives a predator the chance to learn from its uncomfortable but undeadly mistakes from that false model, which then prevents future attacks on the deadly mimic species. So if you're a predator that always goes straight for the deadliest model, then there's never going to be any chance for learning, because you're always going to get killed, and the deadly model is always going to get killed, and no one's ever really going to benefit. But if you are the mimic, and you can mimic something that's a little less poisonous, then once that predator has learned from those less poisonous models in the past, it will apply those same principles to you, and that means that you might get off in the future. And this is something, again, that you would see developing where there isn't already this innate knowledge of a warning signal. So that's quite a complex and confusing kind of example. And there are actually other types of mimicry as well, but these are kind of the main things that we see most often. Now, something else that you can do is distract animals from what's going on, and color can be a really important part of distraction displays that are designed to scare off predators. So if you are sitting there all innocuous, and then all of a sudden a predator is about to pounce on you, one of your best bets is to try to run away. And you might not be able to run away really easily because predators are fast, you know, they're quite coordinated, but if you make them pause for just a second so they kind of get confused and lose track of the circumstance, then you might have just enough time to take flight and get that little bit of edge that you need. And so there are lots of animals that will combine this kind of color and behavior thing in order to make sure that they have a fighting chance if they're ever approached. And so often the animals will look camouflaged at first, but then obviously not that well camouflaged if they're being predated. But then they have a secret patch of color, so at just the critical moment as the potential predator or competitor or whatever attacker is approaching, they'll flash that bit of color, completely distract the other animals, and then take off. And you often see this in insects like butterflies, which will have a brightly colored underwing or have eye spot patterns that they flash whenever they're approached by different predators. Particularly birds get really stunned by eye spots. And even if this doesn't completely get rid of the pursuer, it does give you, as I said, enough chance to maybe take off and get out of the way. And the patterns can also redirect the focus of a predator to a part of the body that's not as vital. So for example, often you find that you'll have eye spots on the end of caterpillars or bright coloration at the wing tips instead of near the body. And this makes sure that if the predator is going to get you, so maybe you aren't ever going to have a fighting chance of getting away, at least the attack is going to come at a particular part of your body where it's going to minimize the chance that you are going to get injured or killed. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was James Vincent McMorrow singing Follow You Down to the Red Oak Tree. Over the break, I discovered that I have gotten a second text message, so today is unprecedented, 2 in a single day, which increases the number I've had by, I won't say by how many, but let's just say it's quite exciting. And actually, this is quite nice because I've gotten some suggestions for future shows, and that is very much appreciated because sometimes it's hard for me to come up with ideas of what I'm going to talk about and some inspirations, and this weekend I was panicking a little bit because I wasn't sure what to talk about this week. So please definitely do let me know what sorts of things you'd like to hear me talk about. You can text the source, you can visit our Facebook site, you can tweet us, and actually I'm on Twitter as well. I'm Special Agent CK, so you can follow me on Twitter and message me there. Sometimes I do also post links that are related to this sort of stuff that I talk about on the show. And you can also visit the Wild Side website in particular, and you can look at all the information that I've talked about on the show and find out about the songs that I've played as well. So do feel free to contact me in any of the various ways available in today's exciting modern technology environment. Alright, so one last little bit of discussion on coloration and then we'll be done for the day. So basically I've talked about all of the major exciting things that have to do with coloration and patterning and the ways that they're produced and the ways in which they're used. Now there are other sorts of advertisement that I haven't really gone into much detail about today, and that's because I have mentioned these things before. So for example, sexual selection. Lots of animals use bright colors and really detailed patterns in order to attract and also hold the attention of potential mates and indicate that they have high quality genes or the ability to go out and get these nutrients and pigments from the environment. Also, animals will use these things to display need. So for example, when you've got chicks that are begging for food in a nest, they have these really bright yellow colors and intricate patterns in their mouths in order to attract the attention of their parents and get as much food from their parents as they possibly can. So these are just examples of how you can use these sorts of things to get someone to interact with you and not just to scare someone off, which is what has been the case for a lot of these other things. I've also mentioned how animals can change the way that they look or develop a particular type of phenotype, including the coloration and the pattern, in order to fool others into thinking that they're a different sex or a different age or whatever different characteristic. So it's also good to remember that lots of non-animals use color, and this is something that can also impact animals. So for example, you've got plants, especially flowers, that use coloration when they're attracting pollinators or to warn off potential predators. And actually plants have a whole range of pigments that you don't even see in animals, and sometimes the pigments that animals use they get from plants. So there can be quite a lot of interesting interaction there between plants and animals. Also, plants of course use chlorophyll, which is a pigment, to absorb energy from light, and a lot of that energy is eventually transferred to animals via the food web. So this is an incredibly important thing, linking animals and plants in coloration. Now I did mention very briefly at the beginning that there are also forms of non-signaling coloration. And I say non-signaling, these things probably could in some way be thought of as signaling something in certain different circumstances, but they weren't primarily developed because that they did signal something. They developed as just a byproduct of kind of the physical form of certain animals. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, physical protection, having dark pigments, especially melanin, that protect tissues from sunburn, from ultraviolet radiation. So, like I said at the beginning of the show, this is one of the driving forces of the variations that we see in human skin color around the globe. People in brighter environments where there's more sun and the sun is more intense will tend to be darker because the melanin in their skin protects them from all of the radiation from the sun. Whereas people who are from the north or places where it's quite dark a lot of the time, they tend to be quite a bit lighter. And you see protective pigments not only in the skin, but also in the eyes and in fur and all sorts of different body parts and coverings. Now, I also very briefly mentioned the idea of incidental coloration, and that is coloration that really has no function. It doesn't signal, it's just merely a biological byproduct. And one really great example of this is cave-dwelling animals that tend to be kind of white or see-through because basically they have no pigment at all. And that's those really weird-looking little crickets or amphibians or salamanders, for example, that you find in caves. Also, in many cases, you'll have animals that kind of have a pinkish hue because they've got this red-colored blood underneath their skin, or animals that are kind of see-through and so you see their guts, their intestines, their organs. None of that actually is serving any sort of signaling purpose that we know of, but it just developed because the animals didn't need coloration for any other purpose, and so they don't have the right pigments to color up what's going on underneath the surface. So that's just a very kind of brief summary of animal coloration and patterning and why we all have it. And I should mention that these things do apply to humans, not just this physical protection example that I mentioned here at the end, but our hair color, and even you could look at human culture and think about the colors that we use in our clothing and in our artwork and in our decoration, because all of these things do have cultural implications as well. And that actually is quite an interesting thing that I can maybe talk about in a future, how humans do use materials of their own in order to send the same sort of signals that animals send using their own physical body parts, only we have kind of these extended phenotypes. In any case, as with last week and the week before, I have recorded this week's show, and I will be putting it up on YouTube as soon as I get the chance. And so you can look for it there, and I will also soon be having podcasts of all the shows. I have a bunch of the recordings all ready to go, and I just have to upload them. So if you missed an earlier episode, or you would like to hear it again, or even download a copy to keep if you're really a fan, those will all be up soon, and you can check the Wildside page in order to find that. And again, like I said before, you can visit Facebook, Twitter, you can text us, you can phone us, whatever you would like to do. And thanks again for listening. I will talk to you next week. Don't forget to let me know if you have suggestions for future topics. And I will leave you now with Cyndi Lauper singing True Colors.